Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to start our program. Hi, everybody. We're going to start our program. You can finish your lunch, but we want to go ahead and get our distinguished speakers up here. My name is Neil Kashkari. I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, and I have the privilege of serving as chairman of the Economic Club of Minnesota. We've had a really great season this year. We're going to end it on a very high note with my friend and colleague, Austan Goolsbee, the president of the Chicago Fed, who's going to be our keynote speaker here today. Austan became president of the Chicago Fed in January of 2023. He was a professor of economics at the Booth School at the University of Chicago beginning in 1995. I got to know Austan. I was at Treasury from 06 to 09, briefly, mostly under the Bush administration, but briefly under the Obama administration. And Austan was there at the beginning of the Obama administration, first as a member and then as chairman of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. We sit on the FOMC together. You know, for some quirk of history, we have assigned seating at the FOMC. And Minneapolis sits next to Chicago. So Austan and I sit next to each other 2 days every 6 weeks. And, you know, the Federal Reserve is quite a reserved state organization. Austan and I are somewhat outliers in that we like to mix it up. And so usually one of us is saying that we disagree with the other one, but it's always in good fun. Austan has a PhD in economics from MIT and went to Yale for his bachelor and master's in economics. And then to try to find somebody who could go toe-to-toe with Austan, I decided to invite CNBC's senior economics reporter, Steve Leisman, who's here with us today. If you turn on CNBC, Steve will be a very familiar face. He's covered monetary policy and economics for a long time. Before CNBC, he was at the Wall Street Journal, earlier the Moscow Times. He's got great stories from Moscow back in the 1990s and earlier in Florida. Steve is a distinguished economics journalist. I told Steve in advance that there are a handful of economics reporters who've covered monetary policy very closely for a long period of time, and they know their stuff. And it is, as a monetary policy maker, it's always a privilege to be interviewed by somebody like that because they know a lot. And so we're really in for a treat today with Steve and with Austan. So please join me in welcoming Austan Goolsbee and Steve Leisman.
All right. Are the mics on? Are we good to go here? You hear us okay? All right. Well, I just say thank you so much, Neil, for that introduction. It was overly kind, at least for me, and actually for Austan, too. I've covered both of these guys for a couple decades now, and I'm a little old-fashioned in the following way. I have deep respect for these guys and the public service they do. I covered Neil during the great financial crisis, and I think we can say ex post we were lucky to have a guy who understood finance at the heart of dealing with it. And I've covered Austan. I think we met at one of those sit-down coffee tables at one of the American Economic Association annual conferences. And people said, you got to get to know this guy. He's going to maybe be something. Yeah, the difference between me and Austan is I need at least 2 cups of coffee to keep up with him. Let's start off right away, Austan, if you don't mind. This morning, inflation expectations numbers came out. They were a little bit on the high side for the near-term 12-month, up to 3.5%. The 5-year inflation expectations were up just a point to 3.1%. Give me your thoughts on how much concern. I mean, maybe for this crowd, I think they kind of get it, but in case they don't, why are inflation expectations important, and what kind of read do you get from the data?
Okay. Let me start. Neil told you, we're like did you ever see the Muppet Show and there was Statler and Waldorf are up in the thing? And that's me and Neil. They do not like that we're sitting next to each other because we always have comments. Look, in the world of central banks, inflation expectations have a prized place in the Ring of Honor because the unanchoring of inflation expectations bodes awful for progress on inflation. And before central banks established credibility, what I call the Volcker Revolution, whenever inflation actually went up, the expectations of what inflation will be in 2 years and 5 years and 10 years, they also went up. And that made the job of a central bank trying to get rid of inflation doubly hard, because the thing that makes the Volcker experience as difficult as it was is he doesn't just have to beat inflation, he has to conquer the fact that everybody thinks and presumes that inflation is going to remain high. And as I say, it kind of has to hold their head under the water for so long that, look, I'm gonna hold your head here until you give up. And that's a pretty brutal process in the economy. So with an inflation target, the Fed gives an inflation target of 2% on the PCE measure of inflation. They're trying to give an anchor to, it's a promise by the Fed, we will get inflation back to 2%. And even at the moment when actual inflation got almost to 10% in the economy this time, if you looked at these measures of expectations, unlike the 70s, unlike other periods, the expectations never went up. So there was a fundamental sense in which the market believed, the Fed said, we will get back to 2%. Yes, it doesn't look good today, but we will do it. And the market believed that. And that's critically important.
Yeah, but
and
they
so
believe
when
you
I
a little
look
bit
at
less this morning, Austan.
Look, the short run expectations isn't what matters. It's the long run expectations.
Right.
The short run expectations, it's a market-based guide, I think, reflecting what we already saw. We already saw that in the first couple of months of this year, inflation, we hit a bump and inflation went up more than we thought. So I'm not surprised that their 1 year expectation of what inflation would be for this year is higher than we thought. I think what I mostly take from that is, despite hitting that bump, the widespread view is not that inflation is
taking off.
You
don't worry about it
control.
getting entrenched on the long run at 3%?
Look, I always say that our job as central bankers worry about everything. Yes, I worry about, do I worry about that? Yes, I worry about that. And I worry about the opposite, worry about deflation, worry about everything. There isn't, at this time, much evidence, in my view, that inflation is stalling out at 3%. If you take a step back, what's happened is inflation went way up in the United States and in everywhere else in the world. I think in large measure driven by negative supply shocks. Then in 2023, we had a fabulous year for the dual mandate of the Fed, which is inflation fell by close to as much as it has ever fallen. And for the first time ever, that occurred without a big recession. And one of the main ways that was possible was because we started getting those negative supply developments healing. For the last 7 months of the year, inflation was 2% or even below 2%. I was hopeful. I was thinking, hey, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the sign. We've been given a sign in the sky, you know, the bat symbol or something. We're on the path. With 2%, it's done. The bat symbol's like, oh, no, it was just a cloud. You know, maybe it wasn't the bat symbol.
Right.
We hit this bump, and now I think, now we wait. You know, when you ask me, oh, wait, are you a dove? Are you a hawk? And I always say, I'm not a bird. I'm in the data dog, the group of the data dogs. And the first rule of the data dogs is know when to walk and know when to sniff. And we move from walking time to sniffing time. And so now we need to sniff some more.
Right. Could you imagine if we actually gave him a cup of coffee? And for the record, I've never asked you if you're a hawk or a dove.
No, you've alleged.
I've alleged you one or the other.
Yeah.
I've never asked you that, but I guess I can call you a dog now. It's okay.
That's right.
Yeah, that'll work. So I'm going to cut to the chase here, Austin, because it's not just because we have investors that are watching and they're ready to punch a button based on what you said. But
I know where this is
But there's a
going.
banker over here who wants to know what you're going to do. But more importantly than that, there's Captain Allen, who is a guide that I use up in Cape Cod. And Allen really wants to buy a couple new motors for one boat, and he wants to buy a new boat.
How many boats do your friends have, Steve?
Captain Allen has a boat for catching tuna and a boat for catching striped bass.
Okay.
And he calls me just about every day. Steve, are interest rates going to go down? Because he wants to buy a boat. So don't answer me. You just look out there, you talk to Captain Allen, and you tell him,
Captain Allen, you need to
can't have
raise
that
your
boat, Allen.
standards of who you're
Allen,
calling.
well, no, that's true. Find somebody better who knows more about rates than I do. But how do you talk to people about whether or not there's going to be some relief to these high interest rates right now?
What will determine whether, we back up. The Congress gave us a law. Our job is not easy, but is simple to understand and straightforward. We maximize employment and stabilize prices. That's the dual mandate. That's what we look at. That's what's going to determine whether we hold rates where they are, whether we cut rates, whether rates are going to go up, is going to be determined by how are we doing on the dual mandate. We've gone through a multi-year period where we've been doing fabulous on the employment side of the mandate and not fabulous on the inflation side of the mandate. So there was no magic required in the job. It was totally obvious. Put the focus on inflation. We got to get inflation back to 2%. Now we're getting, in our language, I think we're relatively restrictive. That is, take the federal funds rate minus the inflation rate, the real interest rate. It's as high as it's been in decades. And if you're going to operate at a position like that, you got to think, how long do you want to be in that position? Because eventually, if you go too long, you're going to have to start thinking about the other side of the mandate too, not just the inflation side. So you didn't ask, and I appreciate that you didn't. Oftentimes, the first and only thing that people ask is, so how many rate cuts do you think they're going to be this year? And my frustration with that is, that's just opinion. If you ask me that, I'm just speculating. And then you'll ask Neil, and he'll give an opinion. And behind that is a theory of the economy and a prediction of what our conditions going to be like. And for me, it doesn't make sense to be tying our hands even partly when we know we're going to get a ton of data to answer the question, is this first couple of months of this year where inflation first went up, has inched back down, but is higher than we wanted, is that a sign of overheating? Or is that a sign of things are happening in the world and we're getting some supply shocks again?
Right. How do you answer that question?
I start sniffing. That's what I answer the question. We don't know. Given we had 7 months of not just progress, 7 months of achievement of our price goal, I'm hesitant to just focus too much. You know, we're walking up a big hill, and if you focus in on just on these rocks. Right. It's like, ooh, it's very rocky, but it's like we made a lot of progress.
It didn't get worse in March, right? It did
not get worse.
It did not get worse. January, February was not great.
January was particularly bad.
Right.
February was better than January, but higher than we were before January. Right. And March has stayed about the same, and we've got to see. I mean, it can lead us into a second category if you want, which is fine, if I don't want to just tell you, here's how many rate cuts for the year, what am I looking at? Do you want me to answer that?
I don't want to go there just yet, but okay. I mean, we could have AI up here. He's doing his own interview with himself, actually, if you think about the way this is going. I'm just going to go finish my coffee. But listen, this is the question I ask, which is, I don't quite ask the question that you were criticizing that I might ask. But
that's what I said. I
don't quite ask that question, but it's a similar question that if you had, say, a PhD in economics, you might look right through it anyway. But here we go. Do you feel like the current rate is sufficient for inflation to come down, for you to hit your target over time?
That's just a sophisticated way to ask the same question.
Damn
You just
straight.
ask the same question.
Damn straight
So
it is.
You can't answer that. You can't, look, if
Did he
everyone
win that round or did I win that round? I think I lost.
There's a gap.
Oh, you're saying I won it, okay.
That's, if
No,
the
what is sufficient?
FOMC put out, I
Yeah,
should have
go
started
ahead.
by saying, to the great relief of almost all my colleagues, everything I say here is just my own opinion. I don't speak for the Fed, for the FOMC, et cetera. But the FOMC puts out a statement, so you can see that the FOMC believes that rate cuts are dependent on getting more evidence to feel confidence that we're on path to 2%. So
Right.
if you were already confident that we are truly on path to 2% over time, the FOMC statement directly implies that is when they would consider rate cuts.
Right.
And I think that goes back to my thing of you got to have a position of, do you think we are restrictive or not? I think we are based on the level of real rates.
Right.
Others, I'm not going to speak for President Kashkari, but he has expressed a viewpoint that says, if it was as restrictive as you think, why is the economy doing as well as it is?
That was
why wouldn't you
my
see
next
more
question.
negatives?
Why wouldn't you see more negatives?
To that, I say three things. One, if you're getting positive supply developments, it can be very misleading to take measures of quantities as an indicator of whether you're overheating, which is to say, if the supply chain is healing, for the same reason we got inflation that exceeded what we were supposed to get, okay, it's not supposed to be, inflation begins soaring in the United States when the unemployment rate was above 6%. That's not really supposed to happen, because 6% unemployment is supposed to mean there's slack in the economy. It did happen because the supply stuff was going bad. The inverse of that is when the unemployment rate is 4 or below, if you see inflation coming down, that strongly feels like positive supply shocks, and therefore you want to be careful taking the unemployment rate or the GDP growth rate as a sign that you're overheating. I think for 23, that was kind of in a way the main issue. The second is we've now come to find out that population growth was substantially bigger than we thought at the time, from some immigration,
It's like
both
another positive
illegal
supply
and
shock.
legal. It's like a supply
right.
shock, but
On the labor side.
but it's really just a caution. I just give everyone caution looking at quantity. Anything that's an aggregate, like payroll job growth or total consumer spending or total GDP. If you just add more people, those numbers are going to be bigger. But in a way, the thing you ought to be doing is per capita.
Sure.
And so we can talk ourselves into if that adds, I think, about 80,000 a month to jobs, given how much immigration was higher than we thought. In a way, you kind of got to subtract 80,000 off the jobs numbers to get a comparable number to what the jobs numbers were before.
You're just making me think of something, though, Austin. What this is really.
This is a dangerous moment.
I know, totally.
Maybe I overshot.
No. But I have read your previous comments about looking at it per capita.
Yeah.
But what I haven't read is what that means for our star.
Okay, is this an R-star crowd?
Well, I don't know, but I don't really
Okay.
care, because I really
Okay.
want to. I need you put more people in the country. You've created greater aggregates, but I don't know how that fleshes out when it comes to thinking about the neutral rate.
Okay, R star is the neutral rate. That's the kind of what do we think? If the R is above the R star, then you're restricting, and if it's below the R star, then you're loosening, or you're what's the opposite of restricting? Yeah, loosening.
Easy.
I have expressed to the great dismay of my economists in the research department at Chicago Fed, I don't like R star because I call it R Sasquatch. Like, we can't see it, we don't know where it is, we can only tell what it was after it's passed. So how does R star affect our decision making? If R star is going up, which maybe it is, why? Let's have a debate about what the things are that increase R star. And the thing to know about, there are two kind of models of where does R star come from. One is it can come out of a theoretical model, and one is we can go estimate it, and a lot of those estimates are based on slow-moving things like demographics and things that don't change. And so my objection with the argument, well, maybe R star is changing, is none of those empirical data contributions that would raise R star have changed in the last 6 months. Okay, it's not that the demographics changed in 6 months. So we're again chasing ghosts. What population would do in the model, I think it's like the demographics, that in the near term, it would mean that if you observe a 3% consumer spending, consumption growth, before you say, that seems really strong, we might be overheating, you'd say, wait a minute, we gotta kind of back that down to correct for just the fact that
it's not as hot as it seems.
Changed.
Yeah.
But I don't know, we still don't know how many immigrants there were, now there are just estimates, or how do they behave? You know, is their spending higher than the typical American? Are they sending remittances back to their home countries, or are they saving, or are they spending?
I'm going to interrupt with a little economics thing that was one of the few things I learned early on, which was there's only two factors you need to know if you want to know what growth is going to be 10 years from now.
Yeah.
The growth in hours worked and growth in productivity. What's great about that is years ago, Greenspan in Jackson Hole gets up and he says, listen, we don't know a lot that's for sure about the economy. We don't have a Planck's constant. We don't have a speed of light. We don't have any constants. What we do know is the vast number of people who are 35 now, in 30 years, will be 65.
Yes.
And I bring that up.
What did you make of that when he said it?
I made of it that there's so much flying blind in the business that you do.
Yeah. And that's not one of those.
You don't even know how many people there are now, which is one of the things you were supposed to know.
Yeah. It's true.
You don't know. What's interesting is that if you bring a lot of people into the country, that should add to growth, except for you don't know their productivity level. If they're lower skilled workers, it brings down the other side of the equation. However, if you should deign to train those people and increase their productivity, well, then you would have both sides of the equation working for you, wouldn't you?
Yes.
But I do want to ask you this. When you think about our Sasquatch, you still need
You're going to get me in trouble with my own people.
You still need a number, right? You can't do policy without some sense of where the neutral rate is, because then you have no sense at all of how restrictive or easy you are.
Yes and no. Okay, he said we're going to come back to one of the great religious wars of economics or of central bank or something.
That's what I do. I stoke the war, then I leave.
Do you think in levels or in changes? And so if you think in changes, you don't necessarily need to know R star. If you're willing to say, well, whatever R star is, I don't think it's changing, and therefore we could talk about tightening or loosening, and we don't have to get in a theoretical discussion like that. But it doesn't really solve anything, because then we're back to instead of saying, well, I think R star is not what it is, then they're saying, well, I think R star is rising, so therefore so you're not tightening. I don't know. I'm not trying to portray that I know what the correct answer is. I was giving you my intuition was we had 7 very successful months on inflation at or below our inflation target. The year 2023 is going to go down, is going to be studied for a long time as one of the best dual mandate years that we've seen. We've hit this bump, and look, I always say 1 month is no months, but 3 months, that's a real month at least. And so that changed my view from we're clearly on a path down to 2% to we have to wait and see. And this uptick in inflation was accompanied with continued strong jobs numbers, continued relatively strong consumer spending and GDP. And that looks more like an overheating observation, not a supply observation, because prices and quantities are going in the same direction.
That's an important observation in the sense that if you think there was an overheating aspect to the recent inflation, does that beg a response by the Federal Reserve?
If it's a long-lasting thing and not a blip, that's when that's how the Fed has to think. That if you make a public commitment to get to 2%, then it means, look, you're in Minneapolis, so you count in my tent. The Midwest motto is, there is no bad weather, there is only bad clothing. We prepare and deal with any conditions, and if these are the conditions, then like in The Godfather, this is the business we've chosen. If we're overheating, we will get inflation back to 2%. Whatever we have to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any suggestions afterwards for how a reporter should handle a comment like that, be more than happy to do it, because I don't know. I would like to tell you, though, if you're interested, I would go online to the Minneapolis Fed website, where Neil has penned an article that doesn't begin, Austin, you're wrong, but it could have begun.
Don't believe everything he says.
It could have begun, Austin, you're wrong.
Yeah.
Neil has a very thoughtful piece that I'll get a chance to ask him about on CNBC in a few minutes that talks about a different idea for gauging the neutral rate. But let me go back to this notion here, Austin, about potential Fed responses here. For what it's worth, and this may be totally...
To the inflation or responses to what?
To an overheating economy.
To an overheating.
I recently quoted Morgan Freeman in The Shawshank Redemption.
Okay.
Which is one of my favorite movies. He begins explaining that geology, like prison, is the study of pressure and time, which I thought was kind of a pretty good metaphor for monetary policy. So there's a couple choices you have here when it comes to responses.
Yeah.
It's existing pressure and time, it's greater pressure and time. And I thought that when I heard Chair Powell speak last week, I heard him saying, I could see us going along longer with current pressure and time. And my question to you is not so much, how would you respond to that? Is it greater, lesser, the same pressure? But how will you know when you need to exert greater pressure?
Okay, that introduces us back to the thing I asked you, did you want to talk about, and you said no. But
not at that point.
You said not at that point.
Now
so now we're
going to
talk about it
now.
So what do I look at in the PCE inflation that would, what are the kinds of things that you would see that would make you feel like, yeah, now we're on a path to 2%, or we're off the path, it's going up, or we've stalled out? I find it helpful breaking out the components. We already break out energy and food. Would drive my mom crazy. She's like, what do you mean you don't pay attention to energy and food prices? But of course, the reason we don't is because they're up, they're down, they're down. They don't give a great signal. They're noisy enough. They don't give as solid a signal of what's the true underlying state of the world. So in core inflation, there's housing, there's goods, there's services. Our 2% target is for the combination. And it's important to remember, those don't grow at the same rate. 2% inflation doesn't mean that inflation on every single thing is going to be 2%. And I just remind everybody, for 8-10 years or something before COVID, we were at or below the 2% target by housing being 3.5% a year, services being 2.5% a year, goods being minus 1% a year. Okay, that's how we got to the 2% target. All of those go up during COVID, and goods up the most. That's kind of a suggestion that the supply chain is a major factor. Now they've come down the most, and a big part of 23 was goods prices basically returning to the minus 1% that they were pre-COVID. Services have come down. They're still above where they were before, but they were in spitting distance of the previous pre-COVID values. In January, they went way up, but they have come down for a couple of months. So to me, the services part looks a little blippy. Housing remains a significant puzzle and challenge, in my view, which is it's still 5-6+% inflation. The market rents, which is what we thought the measures of inflation would be based on, they came down. And so we've been saying for some significant time now, housing inflation is about to come down. If that happens at the rate at which we think, I think we will start to see overall improvement, and it will be fairly clear that there's an optimistic lane that we could ride overall inflation back toward 2%. If it doesn't happen, then we got problems, and we're moving into a different worldview where the Fed has to
And what's the
act.
time period for looking at that?
Reasonable. A reasonable time period.
You guys know the old forecaster's joke, right? Which is give them a date or give them a number, but don't give them both.
Don't give both.
Right.
Right.
Okay. I'll accept reasonable, because I don't think if I push any further, I'm going to do any better. So, 2 years ago, Fed Chair Powell talked about the idea that he expected the economy to run below potential, and thought that it may need to run below potential and unemployment would have to rise in order to bring down inflation. 2023 and 2022, to an extent, proved that to be wrong. So it's sort of a two-part question here. Do you feel like the economy has to run below potential now to get that last bit of inflation out of the economy? And do you have to have now an increase in the unemployment rate to make that happen? And the second part of that question is there anything in the literature, Austan, that told us that the last mile of inflation was going to be a harder mile?
There's a lot deep in that question. That was actually 2 to 3 important questions. But let me work through. I still don't accept that we are stuck at the last mile and that that's going to be the hardest. I think that's one of the things we're trying to determine is, are we hung up at a higher level of inflation, which is kind of like what the 2.5 months say, or is that just a bump, which is what the previous 7 months say? So that's part of what there was no, for the last 7 months of last year, there was no freezing out at 3 or 3.5 or what have you. We were absolutely at 2 or even below 2 for more than half the year. And that leads you into the down in the weeds issue of, is there something wrong with the seasonal adjustments of prices that we're seeing repeated patterns that the last half of the year we're getting great price numbers, and the first 3 months of the year we're kind of getting this repeated pattern that they go up? I don't know.
I did a lot of work on this.
They're trying to make, there is evidence of that.
There's evidence of it.
Is that random, or is that a sign that our seasonal adjustment is wrong? I don't know, but so we got to think about that. To the deeper question, that view that you said, Chair Powell expressed, is kind of the traditional view of a trade-off in the dual mandate of you got to take medicine if you want to fix this thing. As you know, last year I was saying it didn't have to be a trade-off. I kept calling it the golden path, that there was a couple of unusual things about 2023 that I thought we could pull off getting inflation down without a big recession. And we did. Now, maybe I just got lucky, but I think there was an insight that A, expectations had never gone up, which kind of gave us a little bit of running room. B, the supply chain is fixing, and it wasn't just the supply chain like the ports and the computer chips and blah, 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 that one of the biggest supply parts was labor supply. That the pandemic came and everybody's like, I'm not going to work. And now, as labor force participations come roaring back, and if you look at certain groups like prime age women, highest labor force participation ever, 25 to 54 men, stopped declining. That thing was decreasing for a lot of decades, stopped decreasing. Labor supply coming back is a positive supply shock, and that gets to the third of your points. Can we really count on any of that in 24, or is it all done?
Right.
The supply chain is mostly healed. So I think the part that comes from that may be small, but this labor supply stuff has a long lag. So the benefits of labor supply coming back, even if that's done, and now we stabilize and the baby boom starts to retire and the labor force starts coming back down, this part where it went up, it's possible that the benefit of that lasts more than just 2023, that we get some positive for 24, but it's not going to be as big of the increment is not going to be as big as it was in 23. If it were, the inflation rate would go to 1.5%. I mean, that's how much inflation came down. So I think it's not, it doesn't have to be as big of a contribution as it was last year for it to still help us get to the target.
We do want to open up for questions, Cato. We've about that time, but I wanted to ask Austan about AI as well, which is a big topic. I guess the way to start with this is that there's two views. One is it's going to make us all feel a lot better and that things are going to be great. The other is I guess they're coming out with a sequel to Mad Max now. Which is appropriate for the apocalyptic
Which is called
view.
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT is the subhead of it. And so there's the apocalypse idea. I love economic history. I love going back and looking what people said about things before. And you realize, of course, the world was going to end with trains. It was going to end with automobiles. There's always a group of people whose job it is to tell us that the world is going to end because we're going to do this thing, and it never quite works out that way. Not that there isn't pain and other issues that are out there. So give us your view on how, as a policymaker, you look at these things.
Every economist, you scratch the surface, they're more in your first camp. Because it's kind of like in 1921, if you said, how many phone lines are there going to be in America? And you said, 600 million, and they would laugh. Whoa, every person's going to have more than one phone? Yeah, actually, I have two phones in my pocket, and I got one at home.
Yeah.
Yet they would have said, it's impossible. Every man, woman, and child in America will have to be pulling out cords and be a phone operator. Can't be, okay? There's not, except for the voice of Siri, and American Airlines, and that same woman does. There's not, that might be the only operator job left in the United States. But the unemployment rate did not go to 100%.
Do you know why it's 212 and 312?
Why?
Those were the fastest area codes to dial on the rotary phone.
Oh.
Maximizing use of the phone in New York City and Chicago. And then what is Los Angeles?
202 is
DC. Well,
yeah.
that doesn't work. The zero doesn't work. But
the zero
Los Angeles is 312. Is that right?
Yeah,
There you go.
So
Fun trivia facts for 100.
that is a good
Alex.
trivia fact. That technology.
See ya.
Yeah, see, they didn't want to hear
They
from
didn't
you.
know what Minneapolis was going to become.
That was the same thing. They were
Of course,
biased
that
against you.
Become less important with the
But look, these technologies replaced every one of those jobs, and the unemployment rate didn't go to 100%, even in telecom. The telecom sector has employment because the economists are going to say, we're inventing new jobs all the time. If this thing raises our productivity growth rate, it's going to make us all richer. That's how we got to be the richest major economy in the world to begin with. So that's under every economist, I think, is that fundamentally optimistic story. It depends very much on how fast it occurs. We had this whole same discussion about self-driving cars, let's call it 5-8 years ago.
Right.
And the thing to remember is when you see the jobs number is 200,000 a month, that's a net number, okay? Every month, the economy creates 5.1 million jobs and destroys 4.9 million jobs for a net of 200,000. So if there are 8 million truck drivers and professional drivers in the United States, if all 8 million lost their jobs in 1 month, that would be going to be a big mess. But if this thing is slowly adopted and spread out over a long period of time, and we're creating a bunch of new jobs, there is a sense in which that might not even be noticed. And I feel that way about AI. The thing to remember, McKinsey put out this report, and they said AI could replace, I think it was, 50 million jobs were in jeopardy over some period. But the thing to remember is the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that by age 40, the average person has had 11 different jobs. Okay, so we're like, oh, there's 165 million workers. If we destroyed 50 million jobs, that'd be a disaster. But it's like every person is actually good for 11 jobs before age 40. And then you put in context, how is this affecting the dynamism of the economy? And I actually think, I'm hoping that it adds to dynamism. If we could raise the productivity growth rate of the service sector, that would be one of the best things that ever happened to us. It would make us richer. There would be short-run disruptions, no question, but people were going to train into new areas. There's not a fixed number of jobs. And that's the mistake that the non-economists have been making for hundreds of years, is kind of like, there's a fixed number of jobs, and if the machines take these ones, there are going to be less left over for us.
You want to know a fun fact I learned last night sitting next to a commercial real estate guy?
I
when I had a
think I
burger
do
and a
want to
beer.
know. What is it?
You know, they're building data centers in Minnesota. You know why?
Because it's cold.
Because it's cold.
Yeah, exactly. We got it in Illinois,
you know that
too.
already.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Illinois.
That's cool, right? Okay, so I mean, that's cool, right? Okay, let's take some questions. We have a microphone over here, and there's a young lady here who would like to ask a question.
Hold on, we get it.
Just wait for the microphone.
Okay, hi, I'm Shri Zahir. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota and a former chair of the Minneapolis Fed. The question I had for you was, there's we're facing the most restrictive monetary policy ever, as this is something you said, right? And at the same time, inflation is not coming down, and you attributed that to housing inflation in particular being, higher than expected. Is that a sort of some connection through interest rates and housing supply, perhaps?
Yes, maybe.
Love that question.
Yes, maybe. Let me just observe first. Inflation is coming down. Inflation has come down a ton. That's what I want everybody to remember. We hit a bump in January, but with 2023, just look, we cut inflation more than in half from where it was the highs, and we've done that as fast as it's been done on record, close to. On the issue of housing inflation, I do think we have seen that the high rates after a period of such low rates for so long has created this stickiness that a bunch of people are like, I'm not going to move because I got a 3.2 mortgage, and now if I get a mortgage, it's going to be 8%. So I'm just going to stay here. That has withdrawn a bunch of the supply of existing houses that you would normally see. And that's made for a weird dynamic. I don't think that's what's behind the puzzle of the housing in the CPI that we see, because the market rents actually have come down. Like if you go on Zillow or whatever and look at those prices came down. So this is more of a mechanical puzzle of like, wait a minute, why isn't CPI inflation coming down the way the components seem like it would say? What you're describing is a more medium run issue, and it's also only transitory / temporary. Eventually, people got to move. And if the mortgage rates are still 7.5%, 8% in 5 years, when you get transferred, you just have to eat it, and that's what it is. So I think that this supply component, I do think, is a factor.
Yeah, but wouldn't they be building more houses if rates were lower?
When there be more houses, there could be, well, I don't. High rates discourage construction. Lock-in effect from having had these low rates, which discourage putting forward supply from the existing stock, encourages new construction. So the fact that new construction's been a little higher than what you would have thought given the real rates, but the supply of existing homes have been way lower than what you would have thought, I think there is a story at least in which those balance out.
Okay. How about another question? Yes, sir.
If you have the microphone, you kind of have the floor, right?
Right.
Just speak up.
John
if we don't
Healy
see
with
you.
Crown Bank. Thank you guys for being here. What a stimulating discussion, by the way. Two quick questions. One, given the $2 trillion a year government deficit, if the Fed's not buying those treasuries and the investment community is, and the money comes out of investment accounts and the federal government spends it into the economy, how inflationary is that, and how do you guys feel about that? Second, if given the single-family home price has appreciated by about 3 or 4% a year since 1990, how about a 3% target for inflation? Thanks.
Okay. Let's go in reverse order. We are not for we made a promise, a solemn vow, we are going to get inflation to 2%. And my thing is, you do your job before you go looking for a new job. And there are people who said, so convinced that inflation could not come down, that they said the Fed should just declare the new target is 3%, and we won. And I totally oppose it. We said at the time they said it, which is 2012, that the target would be 2.0%. I was kind of publicly a little critical because I felt that it was overly precise, that inflation is a noisy measure, and to suggest 2.0% would be the target, it kind of didn't make sense. Whatever you think about it originally, it's like Trident gum. You remember the old thing of like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum, regardless of whether you thought it was a good idea or not a good idea. Once you recommend 2% is what we're doing, now you just got married. I mean, this thing is done. We are going to get to 2%, not 3%. That's what it is. I'm still optimistic that it's not going to be hung up at 3 in a way that some folks fear, but that's what we're going to have to determine. On your previous question about
Federal deficits.
Yeah, about the deficit, I would just want to add one thing. Yes, the housing inflation is over 3, but you don't want to key everything to just housing inflation. Okay, so if services inflation is lower and goods inflation is lower than that, you wouldn't want to steer all the monetary policy as if housing was the whole economy. On fiscal, you're never going to hear me say anything about fiscal. Well, I became a Fed man, and you know the thing about Fed people, I already told you, we take the conditions and we respond to them. And the Congress is the boss, and they should make whatever the fiscal policy they make, and then we'll react in an optimal way. That's what it needs to be. That's slightly separate from the question of the balance sheet, which was the beginning of your question, that the Fed is buying treasuries. That's a more complicated thing. But suffice it to say, the way we do monetary policy now relies on us paying interest on bank reserves, and it necessitates a larger balance sheet than ever existed back in the old days of open market operations. And so everybody, you just need to wrap their mind around, it can shrink from where it is, but it's never going back to the levels that it was before 2007.
Would you acknowledge that the fiscal deficit is a factor in inflation being high?
There's a whole religious war about how much fiscal policy affects the economy. Does it affect it in a way other than just contributions to overheating? Okay, so there's one view that says, fine, the government is one part of the economy, and exports and imports is one part of the economy, and domestic service is one part of the economy, and overall, you just look at, is the economy overheating? That's what should determine the monetary policy. And then there's another that says, no, government is treated differently. I'm not going to weigh in on that religious battle. I will just tell you, well, I look at conditions, and for anybody who's thinking that the inflation came primarily not from supply shocks, but primarily from stimulus, just remember what matters is delta from last year. Okay, so if you're plus 2 trillion one year and then you don't increase it again, that becomes minus 2 trillion the second year. And if you just go look at not what the level of the deficit is, but the change in the deficit, the incremental, what do you want to call it, the fiscal impulse, let's call it, to GDP,
right,
it looks more like a normal year.
We can't go, I have a response to that, but I'm going to hold it.
I should have waited to the last
We
second.
have a question down here, then we'll get to the one up there. We have only a few more minutes, so.
Should we why don't we take the questions?
Let's take both questions together.
Let's take both questions.
If you guys
and
can
give
keep them
one
short,
answer.
then we'll get one answer.
You're giving me the signal. I went too long. Okay, fine.
Kurt Zellers with the Minnesota Business Partnership. I want to ask about the non-competes. The state of Minnesota banned them here last year. The FCC came out just recently also banning them. As the home of Medtronic, 3M, Polaris, this is a big deal for us. Folks are looking not just at the Midwest migration, but maybe Canada, maybe into Mexico. How is this going to affect, and how, I know the Business Roundtable is sued out in DC, but how is this going to affect migration here in the Midwest? And then will it mean migration throughout the North America, where there's better protections, ironically, in Mexico when it comes to intellectual property?
And the question in the back, please.
As you think about historical components of inflation with goods and services and supply chain, and how that run rate's been comparing in the last couple of years, how do you think of the factors of the expansion of the money supply has yet to work through the system and will continue to put upward pressure on inflation for much longer than you might have anticipated?
Okay, let's address the non-competes. As a legal matter, it's not clear that what they've announced is going to carry through. You're weighing off two things. One is businesses' incentives to invest in their people and training. If we're going to pay all the training and then you're going to pack up and go to somebody else, you're weighing off against the sclerotic nature of if everybody can strap their employees into here and you can never go work for a competitor, then the job market is not going to be as fluid and we're not going to be able to adapt to new ideas as well. I don't have a great sense of how it plays out. the thing on money supply and the back to the Milton Friedman worldview that it's all about money, the thing to remember is the old definitions of what was money have become totally outdated. Okay, it used to be like you'd add up checking accounts, savings accounts, and cash, and that would be one of your main monetary aggregates. The transactions are in a totally different space from that. So I don't put a lot of weight on monetary aggregates as indicators of inflation going forward. That said, the question of how long does it take monetary policy to action to work its way through the economy, that's super important. And in a way, if I had told you 5 years ago the Fed was going to raise the interest rate 500 basis points in a year, people would have said, I think, wow, you're going to have a horrible recession. That's going to be massive. That's going to take a few years to work its way through, but that's going to be devastating. The fact that it wasn't is a bit of a puzzle. And like, if that's the premise of your question, I think that is a bit of a puzzle.
Maybe we want to end it there. Also, I think if we take this on the road, you and I can get like $8 at the door.
Yeah, three.
But
We'll
if we
call it
add
three
Neil, we can
bald
get
guys.
If we add
you know?
Neil, we can get 10.
So let me just tell you all something. You just experienced what I experience every 6 weeks, which is I have to sit next to this guy, listen to him, and there are 20 times I want to respond, and I have to stop myself from responding. And that's like very challenging. But you also, I think they delivered exactly what I expected, a really engaging, thoughtful, insightful discussion. Please join me in thanking our wonderful guests. Thank you.